Which one is more dangerous to us in the West? Is it aggressive secularization or is it Islamification? Were you aware of tensions growing up between Muslims and Christians, or
His
was it
introduction of Sharia law.
We're delighted to be joined in the studio today by our friend, Msgr Michael Nazir-Ali. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Well, I'm sure, Father Michael, that many people know of you, have read some of your work and listened to your interviews before. But perhaps for those who don't, could you tell us a little bit about your background? You were born in Pakistan. Were you born into a Christian family?
Well, my father became a Christian. He was a civil servant. This was before partition, just before partition. And through the influence of friends, really, and he was baptized in a church in New Delhi that had been built by a Muslim noblewoman who had been healed as a result of seeing a vision of Jesus. I mean, as far as I know, she never became a Christian, but she built this church. And so that is where he was baptized. So we had the wider family who were and are, most of them still, Shia Muslims, and my father who was a Christian. So we had a kind of mixed upbringing, really.
That's really unusual, isn't it? To be Shia Muslims in a Sunni country, predominantly?
It's about 20% of the population of what is now Pakistan are Shia. Yeah. Of different kinds, because the Shia are not monolithic either. But we can talk about that forever. So those who want to keep in touch, I keep in touch with them. There's some who don't, so that's also fine.
How was that for you? Your father was raised a Muslim but became a Christian, and then you went to Catholic schools, I understand. Yeah. In the prevailing culture, what were the contrasts? Was it an easy time, or?
Well, at that time, it wasn't as difficult as it is now, I have to say. I mean, we were not really very conscious of this. I mean, I had Muslim friends and Christian friends, and we were all together in this school where I was. 80% of the pupils were Muslims. And I remember we used to begin the day with prayers and, of course, end with the Lord's Prayer. And a Muslim friend of mine said to me once, he said, I can say all of this prayer except the first two words. And I've often thought about that, and I thought, well, that's the difference. It's that for Christians, being able to say Our Father is something that is outside of their kind of ken, as it were.
It's quite remarkable, isn't it, Mark, that you were at this school as a Christian in a Catholic school and 80% were Muslims, and they recognised and accepted is that they had to go along with the ethos of the school, when in the UK we have Catholic schools who feel they have to capitulate to those who aren't Catholic.
Well, this is very regrettable because, of course, people of other faiths, Muslims or Hindus or Sikhs, send their children to Catholic schools because they admire the kind of moral and spiritual structure of the school. So to abandon that would mean, why not go to some other school that doesn't have that ethos?
Were you aware of tensions growing up between Muslims and Christians, or was it your experience that it was generally?
It was later, actually, when I came here to study, and then when I went back, I was ordained an Anglican priest, as you know, and it was then that the process of Islamization was beginning. And so that's when the tensions I first began to be conscious of them. And I remember the then president, Zia-ul-Haq, who was the sort of main engine for this process, he had introduced Sharia penal law, in the country for the first time. And he asked the churches what they thought of this. I was very young then, and the older church leaders prevailed on me to write a paper, on which I did. And I relied on C.S. Lewis's little essay on punishment, saying, well, for Christians, punishment, of course, there must be retribution for the crime committed, but there must also always be the possibility of reform and rehabilitation and so on. And that's not very popular with him when the paper went back to him about what the churches thought about his introduction of Sharia law.
So do you, having experienced both cultures, Father, do you think that which one is more dangerous to us in the West? Is it aggressive secularization or is it Islamification?
Well, secularization has damaged people's psyches. It has caused the faculty of believing to wither away in people. And so that is more dangerous in a way because there is no kind of spiritual awareness. I used to teach when I was at the Bishop of Rochester at the Royal College of Defence Studies. And quite often these Muslim senior officers from different countries would say to me, tell us, how can people survive without a religion? And I think that's the issue. Now, Islamist extremism is an ideology as well. It's not just a religion. And it is an ideology, I suppose it could be compared to Marxism or to National Socialism. So it's a comprehensive ideology, and it is in the market, like other ideologies are, and we have to be aware of the dangers of a totalitarian ideology that is quite alien to the way in which Western legal norms have developed, for instance. So when prominent people said here that Sharia law should be recognized in terms of public law in this country, I opposed it because it is a system that is quite different in its thought forms and its basis to the development of law in this country, which owes everything to Christianity.
It's, in a way, do you think it's quite antithetical to our culture and system?
Oh, indeed. I mean, when I said this, you may remember the then Archbishop of Canterbury, who had said this, that Sharia law should be recognized in this country, and the Lord Chief Justice. Well, there were two things. I mean, one was the Archbishop said, oh, Bishop Michael doesn't understand what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the softer aspects of Sharia, like family law. So I said, okay, let's take family law. Just as both of them and others were saying these things, the House of Lords was still the final court of appeal in the country. And the custom was that the bishop on duty would sit with them when they heard these appeals. And I happened to be on duty and I was sitting with them. And they upheld the appeal of a Lebanese woman against deportation because they said if she was deported back to the Lebanon under Sharia law, her son would be taken from her and given to her husband. So this is the softer aspect of this is family law on questions of divorce, of inheritance, of custody of children, and all of these things. Sharia law is quite different from the way in which law has developed here. And particularly, I mean, secular commentators like Larry Seidentop have shown how the status of women was guaranteed by canon law, first of all, only later incorporated into secular law because, for instance, of marriage, the church's insistence on consent, all of those things.
Do you think that there is then a form of religious illiteracy that's become predominant, especially in our political classes? We often discuss ourselves that when people talk about religion, when politicians talk about religion, they don't seem to really they think we're all a bit stupid. Do you know what I mean? Like everyone who believes in the sky fairy is a bit stupid, and they just have to appease us. And that's what they're trying to do with a lot of these things. Is they see us all as equally. I'm using quite hyperbolic language, but they see us all as equally stupid, and we're trying to express an objective truth and an objective reality and a better way of living.
It's not just religious illiteracy, it's actually historical illiteracy as well. So when I'm in Rome, the day after I arrive, it's the feast of St. Bede.
Yes.
So I've been reading up on Bede. Well, I mean, the very sense of history has been given to this nation, to England, by Bede. And not to be aware of how history is made and how history is written about. I mean, that's not just religious illiteracy, that's historical. I mean, that's just basically illiteracy, full stop. And this can be, I mean, Seidentop and Tom Holland and others are showing how this actually affects what we do today.
How important it is to understand our roots and our culture, yeah. How has this evolved, this situation where they don't seem to understand that, the people who are running the country, basically, or that there's a movement to, do away with it, really, isn't there?
Yeah, there are two ways, I think, in which this happened. So the first is what I call the long, drawn-out, withdrawing roar of the Sea of Faith, the Dover Beach thing. So it took centuries for this to happen, and so certain things can be pinpointed. For example, it became more and more fashionable to be able to ask the what kind of question and the how kind of question. So what kind of thing is this? Charles Darwin spent years researching barnacles, very precise scientific, empirical scientific work. There's nothing wrong with that, because Genesis already tells us that Adam was told to name the things, name the rest of creation. And then the how kind of question, how does this work? How does an organism work? How does an internal combustion engine work? All of these things. Again, nothing wrong with that. But what it did do was it prevented people from asking other very important questions, such as the why kind of question. Why is there a universe? Why am I here? And then, perhaps more importantly, the what for question, the teleological question. What is the purpose of life? What is the purpose of the universe? What is my destiny? Those kinds of questions. This resulted in a secularization of language. I mean, this is continuing, of course. The very obvious example is that holy days became holidays. Words like mission and sabbatical, I mean, these were all just secularized, but they're deeply rooted in the Christian tradition. So it took a long time. Owen Chadwick's book, The Secularization of the European Mind in the 19th Century, is a very good way into this. But then there is the other side to this, is the sudden death theory, that something happened in the 60s that meant that Christianity was no longer important in public life, in public discourse. And what were those things that happened? Well, one was the changing role of women. So Callum Brown, who is a secular sociologist, in his book The Death of Christian Britain, says that this began to happen when women stopped passing on the faith in the home. So he says it was not the church, it was not the school, it was the home where the faith was passed on. And for various reasons having to do with patterns of work expectations of women, the advent of contraception, all of those things meant that women were less and less passing on the faith in the home. The breakdown in intergenerational communication, that's Europe-wide. I mean, I was talking to people involved in Davos, and they said to me that, I asked them, I said, what do you think is the main problem in Western Europe? And they said the main problem in Western Europe is not economics, it's not sociology, it is the breakdown in intergenerational communication. So it used to happen in the school, it's not happening there. It used to happen in the church, well, people are not going to church. It used to happen in the family, and the breakdown in the family is making that more and more difficult. So that was one thing. The other was the students were revolting.
They still are.
When I arrived in Cambridge, the economics faculty had just been occupied by students. And when they were asked, why are you occupying these faculties? They said, oh, they've got secret documents on us. So the interviewer then said, well, where are these documents? And they said, we don't know, they're secret. So there was a change of, rather than accepting a cumulative tradition, to overthrow it in the 60s. And that was replaced by love power and flower power and all of these.
So-called freedom.
So-called freedom, yes, which of course resulted in chaos in many cases. So I think both of these are complementary. I think there was a long, drawn-out process, and there was something sudden that began to happen in the 60s that accounts for it.
Father, I agree with you entirely. We've spoken about family devotions and how important they are in the retaining of our faith. But one thing we've noticed, I think it can't have escaped all our notice in recent years, is a sort of an adoption of a kind of cultural Christianity, wearing it like a flag but without the depth. I'm a Christian. I say I'm a Christian, but I don't go to church. I don't do family devotions with my children. We see this perhaps most keenly in the march that Tommy Robinson arranges in London. I think there's been a few now. And this is not to say that there aren't Christians who take part and for whom their faith matters a great deal. But what do you make of that? Do you think this is something to be wary about, this wearing Christianity like a coat that can be taken on and off?
Yeah, I mean, the cultural Christianity thing, first of all, I mean, I've said this to public figures who've said they are cultural Christians. And I've said, look, if you mean by that the importance of the values of the Christian faith in the public square, these values have arisen from a worldview. They have arisen from the teaching of the Bible, from the constant teaching of the church. I mean, take this question about equality. Why do we believe human beings are equal? I mean, on the face of it, they're not equal. I couldn't win the marathon, however hard I tried.
Mind you, coming up those stairs gave you
that's good practice. So people are not equal in terms of intellectual endowment or physical endowment or wealth, and yet we say they are equal. And this is squarely based on the Bible's teaching that human beings have been created in God's image, whatever other disparities there may be. So you can't say we promote equality in society but not understand why we promote equality. What is the basis for it? Or, there are so many other things, compassion, the basis of a welfare state. So all of these things are grounded in the Christian faith, as many secular commentators are now pointing out. So cultural Christianity, well, I mean, it's better than no Christianity, but it's not enough. And I'm glad that people are now recognizing the abiding value of what the faith and the church has given this nation over the centuries. On the question of this kind of religious nationalism, I think what people have had taken away from them is a sense of identity. And they're trying to find their identity in different things, of which being a Christian is one. I think the mistake that our governors made when Britain was becoming more diverse was to try and accommodate this diversity in terms of multiculturalism, which basically meant we don't know any longer who we are. We certainly don't know who you are. So let's get on with our lives separately and see how it goes. Well, we now can see how it has gone. And rather than if people had been welcomed on the basis of Christian hospitality, Christian dialogue, Christian engagement, to say, this is who we are, you're welcome, but you must know this is how we've got here and who we are. Again, I think this is being realized increasingly, and we now need to understand that the basis for integration is not just having a common language, but knowing where our values come from and why they are there and why they have an important place now and in the future.
That's really interesting because we spoke to Dr. David Starkey, you know, the historian, recently. And one of the things that he was saying was that this is a secular pastiche or an imitation of Christianity. You know, that it's this idea that there's no, you know, in Christ, there's no Jew, there's no Greek, but take out the Christ, if you like.
Well, I'm glad you said that. Yes, yes, David is a fellow of the college in Cambridge where I'm also a fellow, so I see him sometimes. I think Tom Holland is right about this, that even the most secular of values are rooted in a Christian origin, although they have, as you say, become isolated, separated from it. But I think it's quite instructive when these things are being done is to ask the why question. You know, why do you believe this? Tony Blair, when he was Prime Minister, introduced something called pre-legislative scrutiny of bills that were coming up to Parliament. And there was a bill called, well, it was first called the Human Incapacity Bill. Then somebody pointed out that this was a rather infelicitous title, so they changed it to the Human Capacity Bill, same bill. So we were having a pre-legislative scrutiny of this bill, and one of the questions was, are protections normally due to human persons retained for someone in a vegetative state or not? And one of the philosophers who has been responsible for a great deal of our contemporary legislation, she was jumping up and down and saying, well, of course, those protections can never be taken away. So I said to her, why do you think? Why? Why do you think she said, well, slightly embarrassed, I think, well, it's the Judeo-Christian thing that you are made in God's image, isn't it? So I said, yes, that's what I think. I'm very glad to hear you say this. So you have to bring it out. Why? Why, you know, why equality? Why these protections about human dignity and so on? And then the roots of the values are exposed.
Do you think, though, that if it's not grounded in Christ, like fundamentally, that, you know, you're drawing out of her that her principles were based on you know, what the Bible teaches, but if they don't believe in the Bible, at some point, is it easy to just do away with those principles if it's convenient?
Well, yes, that's the danger, of course. I mean, that is indeed the danger. I mean, and that has happened to the family. So the family was grounded in a Christian view of what marriage is, of how children are to be brought up and things like that. But then people like Giddens, the Tony Blair's guru, began to teach that that the family was actually a source of oppression, and that people needed to be free. I mean, again, this strange idea about freedom meaning free of all relationships. And in the end, when he was asked, why do you think the family is oppressive? The answer that he gave was that he had an aunt who had been stuck in an unhappy marriage.
So it's very subjective.
Very
and,
subjective. I mean, rather than the cumulative value of marriage, of course, there are bad marriages. Of course, people struggle in marriage. Who doesn't? But to question the institution as a place for stability of society, of children, of the future, I mean, this is just ridiculous.
But we've seen this happen now as we're discussing assisted suicide, and thanks be to God, it didn't go through Lords. But again, we found the arguments put forward were emotive, subjective, and the law is pedagogical. It should be pedagogical. And the idea that one, I mean, Esther Rantzen, the very presentation of it is based on this promise to one individual woman. It's a strange situation where we've got to this place.
It's almost law-making by celebrity. It all comes down to the individual, doesn't it?
Well, taking Esther Rantzen first, I mean, we are all terminally ill. I mean, we're all going to die. She's been terminally ill for what? How many years is it now?
I don't know, but I know one thing, she's lived a lot longer than they expected.
Well, yeah. So, I mean, what does terminally ill mean? At the root of this is a mutation. So we've been talking about Christian values that the Bible teaches and that the church has constantly taught. So it's not just the Bible so many hundreds of years ago teaching it, but that the church has constantly taught these things. But what has happened with some values, and this is not often said, is that they're mutated. So the biblical and Christian value of human dignity, of inalienable human dignity, has mutated into autonomy. And that's the main argument in the assisted suicide thing, pro-assisted suicide, is the question of autonomy. Why should I not do with my life whatever I wish? The point, of course, is that we are not autonomous. We are relational beings. And this was illustrated to me because the Times asked me to write an article the next day on this BBC program about the man who went to Dignitas. His wife, who was completely against him going there, nevertheless went with him. And she was by his bedside when the medication was being given. And when it was given, he began to choke. And instinctively, the wife reached for a glass of water to give him, and the nurse caught her by the arm and said, "No, this will delay the death." You see, so it is not just us, it is other people who are involved, whether they are spouses or children, or in some cases parents now, with the age being pushed further and further back in so many places. And in the end, it is also people who may be victimized because of our decision. I mean, I may be quite competent to make the decision, but what about people who are not, physically or mentally or whatever it may be?
Wonderful.
Yeah.
It's so interesting spiritually as well. You see, like social media is something that's being credited with dislocating all of those relationships. Everything really that you've talked about, and it's the relational nature of our existence as human beings, isn't it? That really brings these things, crystallizes these things as so important to us. And if you could erode that, I don't know. It seems to be a bit of a plan.
It's very interesting, actually. Quite a lot of educational development theory has been saying for many years that we go from what they call heteronymous morality, that is to say, morality derived from our parents or whatever, to autonomous morality. And it's the feminists who have started to say, no, this is not a linear thing. Of course, we become more and more responsible morally as we grow up, hopefully. But morality is also relational. And I think women feel this more instinctively than men do. And so some kind of correction needs to be made here, and I'm looking forward very much to post-feminists making this case.
I think what it is it's feminism, Alice von Hildebrand said, is a great masculine victory.
Yeah.
And we need feminists, all women, to recognise true femininity.
Yeah.
No better exemplified than in Our Lady. Well, I'll move perhaps to your Catholic faith. We spoke about you being born in Pakistan, and in 1986, the Archbishop of Canterbury, Robert Runcie, arranged for your refuge in England because your life was in danger. Then in England, you became very involved. You assisted the Archbishop of Canterbury. You were involved in the planning of the 1988 Lambeth Conference, notoriously responsible for the ordination of women, the movement on that, and were Bishop of Rochester in 1994. So here you are, an Anglican bishop, high status, and 5 years ago you decided to become Catholic. That must have been I don't know, was that a difficult decision? Was there a single moment, or was it something that had been you've been reflecting on for a long time?
No, I had been reflecting on it because of events. So, where to begin? In that historic meeting between Pope Paul VI and Archbishop Michael Ramsey, the two provided a mandate for Anglicans and Catholics to work together for the restoration of sacramental communion between the two churches. Not just friendship, not just patting each other on the back and so on, but sacramental communion. And so the Anglican Roman Catholic International Commission was established, of which I have been a long-serving member. And we came to some important agreements accepted by both sides as genuinely agreed on the Eucharist, on ministry, and later on the Blessed Virgin Mary, on moral decision-making, and so on. So the problem was that I began to see was that every time we came to some agreement, some Anglicans went and did something that was the opposite of what had been agreed. So on the question of the ordination of women to the presbyterate, for example, and I know this because of my experience, several popes, Paul VI, John Paul II, and later on Pope Benedict, pleaded with successive archbishops of Canterbury not to go ahead with this. They said, we have agreed on the nature of the ministry, and if you do this, it will nullify the agreement in our eyes. So don't do this unilaterally. Well, I remember Archbishop Ramsey replying to one of those letters, saying, even if I wanted to, I could not stop this, again, because of the autonomy of Anglican provinces.
Yeah.
Well, this recurred in a sharper form on the question of women bishops. So now we have a woman Archbishop of Canterbury. I was appointed to chair the commission in the Church of England which considered this matter, and we made a report pointing out all the questions that needed to be asked. But the submission from the Catholic bishops of England and Wales, I remember we had 500 submissions, but they said, you cannot claim to share the ministry of the Catholic Orthodox and Oriental Orthodox churches and then go and do this on your own. And I remember that striking home with me. Cardinal Caspar was sent by the Pope to the Church of England bishops, and he took as his title Episcopatus Unus Est, a quotation from St. Cyprian of Carthage, in which he said you cannot claim to have an episcopacy that is united throughout the world and then make this kind of change on your own. At this same sort of time, the Episcopal Church in the US, in its wisdom, ordained a divorced man who was in an active homophile relationship to the episcopate. We had an archic meeting immediately after that. It was a very stormy meeting. The Catholic co-chairman refused to sit in the same room as the Anglican co-chair. There was an ecumenical service on one of those days, and everyone was invited except the Anglicans. It was in the Catholic cathedral. So this is after Archic had agreed how moral decisions were to be made in the light of the Bible and the tradition of the Church. So this is now becoming a question of capitulation to culture. And two very distinguished Anglicans, Philip Turner and Ephraim Radner, in the book The Fate of Communion, have pointed out that this tendency to capitulate to culture is endemic in Anglicanism because of its origins.
In a sense, it began as a capitulation to culture and a rejection of the authority of Rome.
But it is not just a once-for-all event. It's actually part of the fabric.
Yes.
And different people have tried to escape this. So the Tractarians, for instance, I mean, people like St. John Henry Newman in his Anglican days wanted very much to create overseas bishoprics so they could escape the strictures of the Erastianism of the Church of England. Well, that didn't happen, of course, as we know, looking back on things. But I could see this happening in the Church of England on a whole range of questions, whether it was the acceptability of divorce and further marriage, on questions of identity, on questions of same-sex relationships, a whole number of issues, abortion, fertility treatments, things like that. I was, after the events of the ordination of this person to the episcopate in the Episcopal Church, there was a proposal supported by the leaders of different Anglican provinces, including England, to have a covenant, which meant that, people would not do things on their own. And I was defending this on the floor of General Synod. I had been asked to defend it. And a senior cleric, who's now a very senior cleric, stood up and he said, Bishop, if you think we are going to allow anyone outside England to tell us what to do, you've got another thing coming. And I remember thinking at that time on my feet that whatever this is not the Catholic Church.
Yeah.
So I think that's how it happened, really.
So it's down to a question of authority, fundamentally, is that?
It's not just a question of authority. It's a question of what has always been believed, what has everywhere been believed, and by all. So, what is the universal faith of the Church? What have we received, and how are we going to transmit it? I think those are the questions. Now, authority, of course, assists in that, but authority doesn't invent it. So I remember a senior Vatican official saying to me at one time, what he said actually was the Pope cannot change the faith of the Church. And this is absolutely right. I mean, the Pope can declare the faith of the Church, clarify the faith of the Church, correct what people are wrongly believing, but authority exists to guard the faith uh, and to make sure that it is passed on in a way that is authentic. Now, here, I have to say that the Catholic Church owes a great deal to St. John Henry Newman, because I've admired for a long time how the Orthodox churches value tradition, the passing on of the faith. But my question about that has always been, well, how is this related to contemporary questions that arise? Whether that is assisted suicide or new kinds of fertility treatments, or the nature of the family, whatever it may be.
Nuclear war.
Yes, question of conflict, I mean, armed conflict, those sorts of things. How do we deal with that? And I think Newman's point that however we deal with these situations must, first of all, ensure the conservation of the good news of the gospel. That is what gospel means, of course. How God has not given up on humanity, how God has provided to show us the path to salvation, how the coming of Jesus, his suffering and his death have reconciled us to God. I mean, all of these things, his resurrection from the dead, ascension, the coming of the Spirit, we are in that season, as you were saying. All of that has to be conserved in any relationship with contemporary questions. Then he talked about the continuity of principles. So from the very beginning, already in the Didache, a first century manual on Christian discipline, there is the prohibition on abortion, chemically or surgically. That is already mentioned, both kinds. The rescuing of female children left exposed to die, the way in which high-born women were found in the most disreputable parts of the towns, rescuing other women from prostitution. I mean, all of these things, this continuity of principles is very, very important. And then anticipation of the future. So this is the slippery slope stuff. If we agree something, how will this develop in the next 5 years, 10 years, 15 years? In the passing on of the apostolic teaching, of the apostolic tradition, we also need principles by which the tradition engages with contemporary questions that we are facing. Now, when this happens, as I was saying, we take note of what has been believed everywhere by all people and at all times. But sometimes a question can arise, is this actually genuinely part of apostolic teaching or not? New kinds of fertility treatment, for instance, xenotransplantation. I mean, so many examples can be given. How do we, as Catholics, respond to this kind of thing? Now, that is where authority comes in. And I think the Second Vatican Council's document Dei Verbum is very important in this respect because, first of all, it says Scripture is once for all. It is unique. The Church orients all of its teaching in the light of Scripture. And of course, it is important for scholars to study what Scripture teaches. It is important for us to discover the various trajectories in Scripture and so on. But when all of this has been done, in the end, someone has to say, this is what it means and not that. And that is where authority is important at every level, of course. I mean, every bishop has the task of declaring this in his own diocese or whatever jurisdiction he may have. But some questions, and increasingly in our shrinking world, these are universal questions. Someone has to say this about the universal church. Now, I remember Robert Runcie, who was saying I worked for him. I learned a great deal from him. But he used to say to me several times, he said, people want to make me an Anglican universal primate. But he said, I don't want to be a universal primate. There is only one universal primate, and we must try and make sure that his primacy can be recognized by all the churches.
Speaking of the Pope.
Yes, the Bishop of Rome. I mean, there is no question historically that the Bishop of Rome has had this service for the church since the writing of 1 Clement. When was that? 90 A.D.
But all these things you're brilliantly bringing out, which it's amazing to hear you saying that. Thanks be to God. But we see the opposite happening within the Anglican Church, don't we? We see the manipulation of Scripture. You talk about John Henry Newman. I recall watching Stephen Cottrell quite recently standing up on the floor of the synod and using Newman to validate the prayers for love and faith. The homosexual blessings that they're trying to push through, and Sarah Mullally is in charge of that. So there's an incredible drifting away in Anglicanism, it seems, from even reason. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I think because reason has been replaced by emotion, or mere emotion. I mean, emotion is not bad, of course, but sometimes I'm moved to tears when I'm reading something in the Bible, for example, or in some prayer of the church. But mere emotion, I think that is what is happening. Emotionalism, appeal to emotion. But Newman's ideas about the development of doctrine are very carefully safeguarded in the way that I've just outlined. And this was given fresh expression, actually, by John Paul II in his very important encyclical called Redemptoris Missio, in which he welcomed the church's relationship to culture. Pope Benedict also did this. And yes, that the church's proclamation of the gospel enables, or should enable, every culture to find its true center. But from the point of view of the church, he said, there were two limitations to inculturation, wherever it may be, Africa, Asia, or Europe. And he said these were, first of all, to do, as Newman had said, with the conservation of the gospel. Nothing in inculturation can be done that obscures salvation history, the history of salvation in the Bible and in the church. Secondly, he said, nothing should be done that damages or obscures or fellowship among the churches. So when I come to you from Pakistan, I should find the same faith in you, and when you come to me, you should find the same faith in me. So there cannot be mutual unintelligibility about what we are up to because of enculturation. So I think this is very sensible. I mean, this is that means to say there can be legitimate diversity, but not illegitimate diversity.
And otherwise, how would you recognize what Christianity is?
Well, I mean, you see this, for example, let's take the example of South America. The temptations among the indigenous communities in South America is very much of syncretism, as in other places, and to somehow merge together the teachings of the church about Christ, about the Godhead, about the Blessed Virgin, and so on, with what they have believed traditionally themselves. Now, authentic spiritual aspiration we should recognize, but that is fulfilled in Christ. And that also leads to the rejection of what is wrong and idolatrous. So what we say about them, we must also say about ourselves.
You're very well placed, Father, to speak to how Catholics should navigate this, because what struck me in what you said earlier, and I sort of chuckled because it's not what we see today, is Catholics refused to sit in with this bishop who'd been ordained in the Anglican Church in an irregular situation, and that at one point everyone was invited except the Anglicans. And I thought, we don't see that today, do we? And this is not to be critical of Pope Leo, because goodness knows it's an impossible task, but he was criticised heavily for meeting with so-called Archbishop of Canterbury, Sarah Mullally. But of course, she can't be recognised as a bishop by Catholics. So how do we, lay Catholics, let alone the Pope, navigate these difficulties? Is it enough just to meet and be friendly, or is something like these very difficult stances of excluding and refusing necessary, do you think?
I think it's the way in which you do it. So, of course, the Pope and other Christian leaders have to meet people of many different faiths and of no faith. So Pope Benedict was conducting a very important dialogue with Habermas, for example. He was a humanist, but he was gradually coming to the view that religion is important for human societies from a sociological point of view. Well, of course, you have to do that. I've been trying to arrange a meeting, I think it will happen, between quite a prominent Muslim leader and His Holiness. Of course, if the Dalai Lama came, you remember Pope St. John Paul II organized a pilgrimage to Assisi for people of all faiths. They didn't pray together, but they each prayed in their own group. It is what significance you give to this. So when Pope Paul VI met with Archbishop Ramsay, he took off his episcopal ring and gave it to Archbishop Ramsay. Now, that was some kind of recognition. Henry Chadwick, the great patristic scholar, whom I knew very well, who's been referred to by Catholics as a separated doctor of the Church, an Anglican, when he met with Pope St. John Paul II, he gave him a stole. Well, you don't give a layperson a stole, Now, all that has been jeopardized by what has happened. So I think what this means, what this meeting meant, was friendliness and dialogue on things that can be done together in society and so on. But the original mandate, the restoration of sacramental communion, which we were given, that is no longer on the table.
Pope Leo did actually say that, didn't he? He said that things are, seemingly intractable, yeah?
Well, yes, I think that is right, and they are being made more difficult by the day, not less. I think this is what I regret very much. I think the meeting with the king was probably more important, actually, because the king was made to see what the King of England had meant before the Reformation.
Yes.
And I think he's the kind of person who would be open to that kind of question about cumulative tradition.
If we were to bring it down to basics, just before we draw to a close, Father, what the mission of the Christian in the world today is still so important to you, isn't it? And it's a very biblical approach that you've got. How would you articulate that for our audience?
Well, I've been thinking about that on the train actually this morning. So the first thing that is important is presence. we need to be present as persons, but also as communities. And the parish system in this country, for instance, was designed by Archbishop Theodore of Tarsus precisely to do this, so that there was a Christian presence in every community. I think our Catholic parishes need to be reminded that they are there not just for the gathered congregation, but for the community around them. I think that's very important. But then in England, the preaching orders were very important, the Dominicans and the Franciscans, because what they did was they went around, and peregrination, going around and finding places where there is a response, is also very important. Now, this need not be physically moving around in our day and age. It might be social media. It may be the conventional media. It may be the newspapers. I mean, if you write in the newspapers, you get bouquets as well as brickbats, but I think it's worth doing, So those two aspects, I sometimes speak of them as hospitality and embassy. So hospitality to those who come in, and more people are coming into our churches who have never been before. And the first thing to do is not to ask them the question, are you a Catholic? But to say, welcome, whoever you are, and then take it on.
Oh, that means we can't go shunning people and
No, exactly.
welcome. Okay, welcome.
Oh, you know what
Welcome.
I mean.
Yeah.
Exactly. But then there is this duty of embassy, which is of going out to places where we may not be comfortable, challenging places. Finding a response on the margins of society. You see, the church has always grown on the margins, and then the people on the margins come to the center. Openness to culture and to assuring people that their culture is not in danger from the gospel, that the gospel comes to enrich their culture and enable it to find its true values. I mean, I think this is, rather than just capitulating, to an active engagement and dialogue with culture. I mean, the social service. The Catholic Church has such a long tradition of social service. Ruth Fowle was a nun who gave all of her life to treating leprosy patients in Pakistan. When she died, the Islamic government gave her a state funeral. You see, because no one had done what she had done for, I think, 60 years or so. This kind of witness cannot easily be forgotten. The nun who first began in Kenya to take children into her home, eventually became an orphanage, of those whose parents had died of AIDS. We need to hear a lot more about this. I was in Baghdad during the civil conflict there, and I was taken to meet with the Sisters of Charity right in the red zone. I mean, you could hear gunfire, you could hear explosions. Everyone had walls all around their houses to prevent people getting in. And here were these sisters in a house without any walls, no protection, no security. And they were bringing up children who had been abandoned because they suffered from severe disabilities brought about by Saddam Hussein's attacks, chemical and biological, on his own people.
Amazing.
So they were bringing up these children, they were bringing them up
In a war zone.
in the war zone as Catholics, singing choruses, going to mass, and all of this kind of. So I said to the sisters, mainly from India and Bangladesh, Sisters of Charity, I said, you don't have any protection here you're bringing up these children who are probably from Muslim backgrounds as Catholics. Does nobody object? And they said, nobody wants these children.
Nobody
Who's going to
cares.
object? You know. But that's an example of mission on the margins. That's what, I mean, the little brothers and sisters do similar things. After the revolution, I was in Tehran, I went to the university, and there was a Frenchman little brother. And I said, what are you doing here? They've thrown out all the missionaries. He said, yes, but the university won't let me go. You see? When I was in Karachi, I had some pastoral responsibility in Pakistan for a very violent area. And the little sisters were there in a house, just a ordinary house. And I said to them, you know, I come in and go out. You live here. I mean, this is a very violent area. And they said, nobody's going to do us any harm because we are the only good thing happening here. Right. So that's
powerful.
mission.
Yeah, transformative, isn't it? Yeah.
And in so much of what you say, there's this common thing, even though you were at a school that was 80% Islamic, in a country where we have people coming into the country, the sisters in Baghdad who helped Muslim children, the key thing is you don't have to change, you know, in all of those situations, you're Catholic, there's no compromise, but you are charitable and loving, and you show what your faith is rather than say, I'm ashamed of my faith and I need to water it down or capitulate, and then reach out in love without having to deny Christ, really.
And my experience generally is that people expect you to do this. I mean, people of other faiths expect you to do this just as they do it themselves.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I know we need to stop, but I was in a taxi recently, and no, it wasn't a taxi, Father. It was an AA man, because I'd broken down, and we were chatting as he was driving me home, and he was a Muslim. He was a very friendly guy, and we were chatting, and he was shocked when I started talking about my faith. And he said, I've been doing this job. I've never met an English person who talks about being a Christian. And he said, I like it, because we come here and we feel like we don't know what you're about. What is England? It's not. And this Muslim was saying to me, it's lovely to hear you talk about your Christianity.
Absolutely.
We must be that witness.
Mm.
Well, thank you very much, Father Msgr Michael Nazir-Ali, for joining us.
It's been a great pleasure. Thank you. We're very lucky to have had you. And please God, everyone get something important from the things that you said. So
Let us pray so.
yeah, thank you very much.